You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
What are worldly assumptions about knowing what is right or wrong? Can we know what is right or wrong? And how do believers in Christ respond to those worldly assumptions? Today, we move into the next topic in our series on Prepared with a Reason from Concordia Publishing House. This episode of The Coffee Hour is underwritten in part by Concordia University, Wisconsin. You can learn more about Concordia University, Wisconsin by visiting cuw.edu.
Live uncommon.
Joining us today, the Reverend Joe Cox. He's head of academics at Lutheran High School South here in St. Louis, Missouri. He also authored topic number 5, We Should Know Better. Prepared with a Reason from Concordia Publishing House. Pastor Cox, welcome back to the Coffee Hour.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you today.
So we got you out of school today to come hang out with us and talk about this topic. You're probably missing like all kinds of important things in school. So sorry for missing stuff at school.
No, that's okay. It's kind of fun when I can look at the teachers and say, hey, I need you to cover my class. I snuck out and no, it was good to get out and have that opportunity to sometimes step out of the school building. We're getting to that point of the year where a lot of teachers will not see the sun Monday through Friday because you're there before it comes up and you leave after it goes down. So it's good to get a couple of last glimpses.
Daylight.
Man.
Well, thank you for taking a field trip for one today so that we could talk about this topic that you got to write about for Prepared with a Reason from Concordia Publishing House. Let's talk about the discipline of philosophy that seeks to answer questions about right and wrong. What do we call this?
Yeah, it's funny you ask that because when you talk about the disciplines of philosophy, you've got lots of like really fun big names like axiology and ontology and epistemology. This is ethics.
Can we add an ology to it?
That's kind of boring.
Yeah, the ethicology, morology. Yeah, no, it keeps it simple. At least, it fits really nicely on the course title as we talk about ethics and talk about how not only how the world looks at these questions about right and wrong, on a broader level, philosophically speaking, about what really constitutes right, what constitutes wrong, but also how do we implement them in our own lives and how do they have implications in terms of how we live? And then, of course, when we're talking philosophy, it's really important, especially in a situation like this, to make this distinction and recognize that in many ways, philosophy is a useful but secular study. And we are also theologians, and we need to recognize that where that secular study provides a useful tool, that's where we're going to engage. But ultimately, we're going to approach these questions of right and wrong from a theological perspective and coming back to how God's word guides us, specifically within the revelation of Jesus Christ and his death and his resurrection, and how that historical event by which God reveals the ultimacy of his love really reveals to us his intent for the world and the part that he's given us to play in it.
So how have humans throughout history discerned right from wrong?
That's that. Well,
all of history. Can you cover all of it?
In 5 minutes.
Casting lots. No, Dr. Iyer, in his book, Holy People, Holy Lives, and I'm going back, probably the very beginning of this century, but it is a book that's really accessible. And he's really helpful in giving a real broad overview that I like to use. And so I want to at least acknowledge my source here.
Yeah.
And he really presents the concept 3 basic stages that when we're talking about ancient people, and again, we're doing a gloss, but when we're talking about ancient people, there's a sense that the concepts of right and wrong and where they come from are revealed to us. We need something that is outside of us to communicate that to us. Now, if we're going to talk about some of the big name philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, we might get into concepts of there is this world in which we live, the world of form and the world of matter, and what Plato is going to call the real world, which is the world beyond that, the world of absolutes. And in those world of absolutes, these moral systems exist. And so it's incumbent upon us to conform ourselves for the best of life to those eternal, non-changing principles that exist outside of us. Now, of course, that isn't entirely divorced from another ancient philosopher, if you will. Let's go to Moses, who once again receives by revelation the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, by which God reveals the one who has created this world and has, again, those unchanging principles of how the world was designed to work in terms of our behavior, both toward God and also toward one another. And so in both cases, we have this sense that there is that thing, God, and I don't mean that dismissively, but trying to include both the philosophy and the theology, who reveal to us in some way those unchangeable principles. Move ahead through history, and you have a combining of philosophy and theology during the early medieval age. But eventually you get to what we call the Age of Enlightenment. And you have a sense where people start, and I think the early philosophers who do this have some good instincts. Their desire is to demonstrate that you don't need to just say, "Thus saith the Lord," which isn't always the most satisfying answer. But they say, look, we can look around us. We have this natural law, which St. Paul writes about in Romans. We can, using the reason that God has given us, discern right and wrong in the world. But slowly there's this shift. And so the revelation from God starts to take a back seat. And this concept of right and wrong, and again, in these early Enlightenment philosophers, it parallels well with Christianity. But as the emphasis is more on the ability to reason for ourselves, suddenly the nexus of that reasoning starts to find itself in the human mind and reason. And so we see a transformation. We start coming up with things like moralistic calculus that, hey, we can take all the moral questions of the world and turn them into equations.
That doesn't sound nice.
No, it doesn't always. In fact, I think it's called hedonistic calculus.
It makes my stomach hurt.
It makes me very uncomfortable.
Well, and it should, maybe makes your brain hurt at first, but eventually that kind of moves to the point where that nexus changes from the human head to the heart, to the emotion, where it's now about what you feel. And we start getting into the ambiguity where morality is located entirely in the individual, apart from perhaps anything else that's outside. And I'm going to pick on a TV show that I guess has had, 50 seasons now or something. But you remember Survivor? I think it's still on, actually.
I think so.
And their tagline, at least back in the old days when I watched it, outwit, outlast, outlong, or something like that. The whole premise was do whatever is necessary to survive. How do you determine your principles? As far as I know, there's only one rule in the game, which is that you cannot do physical violence to another person. But other than that, anything goes if it serves you as an individual. And so we've seen over the course of time that transformation. And I use Survivor because it's a really nice microcosm for the world in which we live today, where the morality that is espoused has more to do with how loud somebody can shout and how passionate a person can be, while at the same time perhaps dismissing anybody who doesn't have the same view you have, while ironically claiming that all people have rights to their own views. So we live in this really confused place when it comes to how do we conduct ethics in our society today. And yet, if we don't find a way to have these conversations, not just as individuals and not just with our children, but as a society risks unraveling, because at the end of the day, we have to move forward with the decisions of what's right and wrong and how that governs our society.
So in a modern assumption, morality or ethics is only universally objective when it's convenient for me.
I would actually go so far, I think even this term is passé, but you say modern, I would actually go to postmodern or post-postmodern.
Yes. Just showed my age.
No, but yes, it's very much a matter of convenience can dictate. And it's interesting to hear people who are really so ingrained in that thinking, to hear them try to explain away when you maybe even see them pivot away from something they claimed was so important on one level and suddenly isn't. I think about the politician who known for standing for the rights of women and really trying to lift that up on one level here in the United States, turns around and actually supports how women are being treated in a place like Afghanistan 20 years ago, because that's appropriate for their culture. And so you have this weird pivot. How can you make such strong stances for women on one level and then turn around and support the exact opposite on another and still maintain some sort of consistent analysis? And so it gets really weird sometimes.
Well, we're good at being weird, so we're going
to
talk about some worldly assumptions, more worldly assumptions in just a moment as we continue our conversation on Prepared with Reason from Concordia Publishing House. You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
At Concordia University, Wisconsin, we believe you were created for a reason, to use your God-given gifts to help others, to live a life of self-sacrifice in a me-first world, to live a life that's uncommon. Whether you're taking one of 50-plus online programs or learning with us in person on the shores of Lake Michigan, you'll be equipped to make an uncommon impact. Learn more at cuw.edu. Concordia University, Wisconsin. Live uncommon.
Welcome back to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Gulseth.
We are continuing our conversation in the Prepared with a Reason series. Our guest today, the Reverend Joe Cox. He's head of academics at Lutheran High School South, and he wrote the topic, We Should Know Better, the topic of ethics, is what we're looking at today.
Do better.
Do better. That comes out of some of those worldly assumptions. What are some worldly assumptions regarding ethics today?
The biggest one, again, as I mentioned previously, is that ethics has come to be centered within the individual, and that it's an interesting balancing act that actually dates back to a guy by the name of Kant. And he's wrestling with the fact that in order to be held accountable, a person has to have autonomy, which is really big in our culture today. But he also balanced it, again, here's those fancyology words, with deontology, the sense that we have duty to one another. So for example, in order to enter into a contract, one must be autonomous in order to do that. But once one enters into a contract, one has obligations to be honest, to be fair, to be transparent to the other people in the contract. Today, I think the assumption is that the duty has fallen away. Ironically, I think we have a better word for that in the church. We have a sense of vocation, that we are called to serve in love those around us. And our culture has pushed that service aspect. The concept of being servant to others is anathema to our modern day American psyche. But we have clung so deeply to that sense of autonomy that I am a law unto myself and you have no right to hold me accountable for anything. Only I can be the judge. And so there's your second moral assumption, is that there is no judge above us, that there is not a God who, again, has dictated from eternity and designed how we live. And again, the sadness is there's this attempt with the grasping of that sense of autonomy to try to have freedom from God's design. So again, as scripture points out so clearly, we run to the things, St. Paul says, that are not God's, and we treat them as though they are God's. And those things that overcome us, St. Peter will say, they are the things that enslave us. So I'm using kind of society as a whole, but in our attempt to run away and try to find quote unquote freedom from God's design, we run to the very things that would enslave us. And somehow we call that freedom. And we find ourselves in a captivity that we ourselves don't even see.
What does worldly ethics say about Christian ethics? What is that outside view of like what the world assumes about ethics now, about everything being internal and everybody, your morality is whatever you feel. What does that say then about Christian ethics and what we believe? Yeah,
it gets really interesting because here again is where we have that weird, strange pivot where it's okay for everybody to have their own opinion. Unless you're a Christian. And on one hand, I want to be really careful and really sensitive to not fall in the trap of we Christians who are so persecuted, particularly in the United States, where I think it's safe to say we have not faced the kind of persecution that our brothers and sisters around the world and throughout the ages have had to face. And so I want to be careful with that. But on the other hand, it is odd and it's telling that you have even, let's say, Judaism or Islam, which are monotheistic religions, who again will make claims that there is a divine judge who determines senses of right and wrong, and there's going to be spectrums in terms of how that's approached. And those sometimes seem to be treated slightly differently than Christians. And the rejection here is kind of another turn that happens, is this sense that in the 19th century, we have a philosopher who comes along by the name of Nietzsche, and he starts making this argument that ethics are really nothing more than power. If there is no God, there is no actual moral absolute, and anybody who claims that such is merely trying to assert power over you through the power of guilt, etc. And perhaps just by the very accident of Christianity being the primary religion throughout the development of the Western world, maybe that gets thrown back at Christians in particular, that Christian morality is dismissed. But there's a second side, and there's one that we have to be very careful of. Oftentimes that dismissiveness comes because we have used the law as a battering ram against people in a way that, while might be objectively correct in identifying that which is sin and that which is outside of God's design, we sometimes miss that God desires mercy and not sacrifice as we approach people who are caught up in that sometimes we treat our fellow humans as the enemy, when in fact maybe we should be treating them as those who have become enslaved by the God of this world, and that we have callings where we can serve them by pointing them to the true freedom that Christ offers through his death and resurrection. And that sets us free in a completely weird and paradoxical way, which we Lutherans love. The freedom to serve, not because I have to, but because I get to. Because true love is going to serve. True love, as we see demonstrated by God himself, reaches outside of the self to those around. And all of a sudden, the very things that I'm grasping onto suddenly are revealed for what they are. Not the absolute manifestation of my autonomy, but rather the fact that I've let the external things of the world, the things that are lesser, actually have control over who I am.
So we have, I think, a good grasp of some of these worldly assumptions regarding ethics, regarding morality, right and wrong. What does God's word teach us about responding to these worldly views of right and wrong, or that there is no right and wrong?
Yeah. Well, let's start at the very beginning. I mentioned the 10 Commandments, that what we have here is a template, if you will, of what God's design is in terms of our behavior. You've got thou shalt not steal. And as you look at the small catechism and you see how Luther starts to unpack this, it's more than just not taking something that belongs to your neighbor, but it has to do with how it is that we treat and respect and help each other take care of property. So that these 10 commandments, or these 10 words, as we get to in the original text, are really all about unpacking how we live and serve. And yet it's really interesting if we go back to Exodus, we go back to Deuteronomy, and there's, different numbering systems of the 10 commandments. But if you go back, you see that the first word is really a proclamation of gospel. I, the Lord your God, have rescued you from slavery in Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. That if that becomes the starting point for how we talk about ethics, that ethics begins in having been set free from slavery, not just physical bonds, but the slavery of sin. Once again, we find ourselves in this place of, how do I love you in the way God designed us to love and to be loved, so that I can help you become the fullest person that you were expected to be. And suddenly morality or ethics stops being thou shalt and thou shalt not to be dismissive of that biblical language, but it really starts freeing us to find ways to serve our fellow human being. ultimately, I would say it comes back to St. Paul says in Romans 13 that love is the fulfillment of the law. And that needs to be the place where we're really starting when we talk about what Christian ethics looks like.
Mm-hmm. Why is ethics so exciting to you? Why do you enjoy studying, or why is it interesting to you to study ethics and this kind of philosophy?
I'm a nerd.
That's fair.
So, you know what? Actually, I think I violated my own use of the word. I'm a geek, or a little bit of both. Science fiction is actually what got me into it. I love science fiction movies.
Yeah.
I love comic books. And those stories that I was growing up with actually involved a lot of this. If you go back and you pay attention to a lot of science fiction, whether you're talking kind of the classic authors or you're talking about science fiction movies, these questions are being wrestled with. You can't watch a cloning movie without questions of what does it mean to be human? How do we treat humans? And so that was really what whetted my appetite originally as I started getting into ethics, kind of that transferred me into the concept of bioethics and then just getting into philosophy as a whole. So I kind of found my way in by the back door, so to speak. My first call, I was handed a class on ethics. Hey, what are you going to do with this? And that just kind of pulled it all together. And we actually watched some science fiction movies in that first class. And, for the next quarter century, it's been one of the things that I play around with. And I enjoy being able to have those conversations and really being able to challenge what does it mean to live as faithful Christians in a world that sometimes is so upside down. And so that's really where that comes from.
What did you learn in your research to prepare these materials for Prepared with a Reason?
One of the things I had an opportunity to do is dive a little bit deeper into a couple of areas and really look at some of the minute transformations that happen over the passage of time by some of the philosophers that I didn't necessarily pay attention to. You're teaching a one semester ethics class to Christian high school students. And so you're just hitting the big names. And so I had a chance to at least look into that and see kind of how the movement over time happened at a little bit more of a micro level. Another thing I got into was just looking specifically at how things have kind of unfolded. In part of the Prepared for a Reason, I have reference to, and of course, I'm blanking on the name of the author, but a psychologist who 1970s, as he was trying to promote homosexuality, and he proposed that this term that is so ubiquitous today, homophobia, actually be added to the DSM, which is that official document of mental illnesses. And so he was suggesting, and if you take that word at its heart, one who is fearful, phobia, it was really meant to be a mental illness. Now, the folks who were working with him rejected that movement, but what's happened is that term itself has now grown to become something that is used, and not uniquely against Christians. This is going to be used even against non-Christians who look at what's going on in terms of sexuality in the world today. And it becomes a way of just simply dismissing the conversation altogether. You are against this behavior or this attitude, therefore you are hateful, you are bigot, you are fill in the blank. And it's interesting how we've gotten to this point that, again, the person who yells the loudest, the person who can shut down conversation by virtue of being dismissive with labels, suddenly wins the day and determines what morality is. And that's scary on one level because there's only one step left for how much worse it can get. Now, having said that, I was just listening to the news the other day, and there's the argument that things have gotten a little bit so crazy on some levels in our world that the pendulum's starting to shift, that the craziness has been unmasked to the point where it is so bluntly obvious at times. And it was a conversation dealing with women's sports and all the things that are going on there with the question of transgender athletes. So all's not lost. And at the end of the day, we have a hope that Christ is returning. And so no matter how crazy, no matter how topsy-turvy this world gets, and I think an appropriate biblical reading is to expect that it will get worse, we have a hope that transcends how crazy it might get. And that hope is rooted in the ultimate ethic, the ethic that God himself reveals through Jesus Christ. And so we have that hope to carry on, and that it's incumbent upon us to instill in our young people that they're headed off to some real crazy stuff. I experienced it when I was in college, which is part of what got me into teaching the youth today. Is I went off to a secular university and I wasn't really prepared for what I was going to encounter. And so my goal here is that they're ready for it. They've heard it. They know there are answers to the questions that are being asked, and they have that hope that is rooted in the gospel.
Our guest today, the Reverend Joe Cox, head of academics at Lutheran High School South in St. Louis, Missouri. He wrote topic number 5, We Should Know Better, Ethics, in Prepared with a Reason from Concordia Publishing House. Thanks for talking with us today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be with here, both of you.
You've been listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Sarah Golseth.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@KFUO.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.